The gallows groaned under its own weight, the wooden frame trembling like a beast bracing for a storm. The noose hung loose, swaying in the dry, merciless wind that carried the stench of sweat, whiskey, and the sour tang of hatred. Myra's feet, raw and blistered, scraped against the splintered platform as she stood motionless, her swollen belly pressing against the coarse fabric of her torn dress, a defiant, living shield against the venom spewing from the crowd. "Witch!" a woman shrieked, her voice cracking like brittle glass. "Liar!" barked a man, his face sun-weathered but his eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. A child clutched a doll and stared, wide-eyed, as Myra's wrists, raw from ropes that had chafed her skin to bleeding, curled into fists. Her lips, split and crusted with dried blood, parted to speak, but no words came. Her eyes, sharp and unbroken, scanned the horizon, the crowd, the sky, searching for him. The one who'd whispered promises in the dark, the man who'd said, "Trust me." Sheriff Amos Reed loomed beside her, his jowls glistening with sweat despite the morning chill, his hand hovering near his revolver like a vulture circling carrion. "Confess," he growled, his breath reeking of tobacco and spite. Myra lifted her chin, her jaw tightening as the baby inside her kicked, a frantic, rhythmic plea. Then a flicker, a shadow detaching itself from the throng, soundless as a ghost. No horse snorted, no boots thudded. Just a man in black, his coat snapping like a flag in the wind, his hand resting on a Bowie knife that caught the light like a sliver of moonlight. Time fractured. The crowd's jeers blurred into a distant hum. The stranger's eyes locked onto Myra's, steady, unreadable, and in that heartbeat, the rope snapped. The severed hemp slithered down like a dying serpent, and chaos erupted. Gas exploded like gunfire. A woman screamed. Deputy Hank lurched forward, his hand trembling on his holster, his scarred cheek twitching as he remembered the bite Myra had left there months ago. The trapdoor beneath her shuddered, but Myra didn't fall. She staggered, dazed, as the stranger's voice cut through the pandemonium. "Duck!" She obeyed, just as the blade flashed again, this time toward the sheriff, who recoiled with a curse. The crowd scattered like leaves in a gale, some diving for cover, others reaching for hidden knives or pistols. Myra's breath came in ragged bursts, her hands cradling her belly as the stranger yanked her arm and propelled her toward the alley. Behind them, the gallows swayed, empty and defiant, as if the structure itself had exhaled a breath it had held for decades. Cole's grip on Myra's arm was iron, unyielding as he yanked her into the shadowed alley, the stench of rotting meat from the butcher's stall clinging to the air. Her bare feet slipped in the dust, smearing blood from her raw wrists into crimson streaks that glistened under the pale sun. The shouts behind them, curses, panicked cries, faded into a dull roar as he shoved her against the splintered wall, his body shielding hers. "Who are you?" she gasped, her voice frayed at the edges, fingers clawing at his coat like it might anchor her to life itself. Cole didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the stable ahead. The horse tethered there, shifting restlessly, ears twitching at the chaos. Silence had always been his armor, his weapon, his penance. Words were bullets. He wasted none. They reached the horse in a blur of motion, Myra's breath hitching as Cole hoisted her onto the saddle, his hand steady despite the gunfire cracking behind them. Bullets chipped at the wooden beams of the stable, splinters raining down like cursed confetti. He swung up behind her, his chest a solid wall against her trembling back. "Hold on," he muttered, his voice gravel, roughened by years of swallowing regrets. The horse bolted, its hooves pounding the earth like war drums as Dry Creek's fury fell away, replaced by the jagged expanse of the desert. Hours passed. The sun bled into the canyon walls, painting them the color of old wounds. Myra's head lolled back against Cole's shoulder, her lips cracked, her eyes glazed with exhaustion. "Cole," she rasped, testing the name like a fragile thing. "Just Cole," he replied, the syllables hollow, as if even speaking them stripped him of something. She turned her face toward him, studying the scar that carved a crooked line from jaw to temple, the dark circles etched beneath his eyes. "Why?" she pressed, her voice sharpening with defiance, as though demanding the truth might tether her to the living. Cole's gaze locked on the horizon, where the sky met the earth in a seamless blur of dust and dying light. "A woman once," he began, the words scraping out like shards of glass. "Same Gallows. Different crowd." His jaw clenched, the muscle jumping as if the memory gnawed at him. I hesitated. The admission hung between them, heavier than the desert heat. Myra's hand drifted to her belly, feeling the baby's frantic kick, a tiny heartbeat against her palm. "She broke," he finished, the final word a tombstone. "You didn't cut her rope," Mira whispered, her throat tight, the question laced with accusation and understanding. Cole's fingers tightened on the reins, his knuckles bleaching white. "No," he said flatly, "but I did yours." Before she could speak, the sharp crack of gunshots split the air. A bullet whizzed past, kicking up a spray of sand. Cole cursed, urging the horse faster as the canyon walls closed around them, their shadows stretching long and thin like skeletal fingers. Mira hunched forward, her belly pressed to the horse's sweat-slicked neck, every jolt of fresh agony. Behind them, the world dissolved into a cacophony of hooves and hate, the town's wrath trailing them like a vengeful storm. Colden looked back. He never did. But as the canyon swallowed them whole, his mind replayed the woman's face, the one he'd failed, the one who'd haunted his every step since. Clara's eyes, wide and unblinking, as the rope snapped taut. Clara's scream silenced Medare. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat. Myra's breath hitched against his chest, her hand gripping his arm like a lifeline. "They'll catch us," she murmured, the fear in her voice a mirror of the terror he'd buried long ago. "Let him try," Cole growled, his jaw set, his resolve harder than the desert stone beneath them. The horse surged forward, its breaths ragged, its flanks flecked with foam. Ahead, the canyon twisted, narrowing into a gauntlet of jagged rock and shifting shadows. The past clung to Cole like a second skin, but the present demanded survival. For her, for the child, for the ghost of a woman who'd taught him that hesitation was a death sentence. Gunfire erupted again, closer this time. A bullet grazed the horse's flank, and the animal reared, nearly unseating them. Mira cried out, her voice swallowed by the wind as Cole wrestled the reins, his knuckles raw. "Hold tight," he barked, his voice a command, a prayer. The canyon walls blurred into a streak of crimson and gold as they plunged deeper into the wild, the echoes of Dry Creek fading behind them. Cole's hands never shook, but as Myra's trembling subsided into a quiet, dogged determination, he felt something shift, a thread of hope, thin as a hairline fracture, threading through the cracks of his soul. She was alive. The baby was alive. And for the first time in years, he hadn't hesitated. The canyon walls loomed like ancient sentinels, their jagged edges swallowing the firelight whole, leaving only fractured shadows to dance across Myra's face. The air was thick with the scent of sagebrush and damp earth, the kind of stillness that pressed against the skin like a held breath. Myra's hands trembled as she tore into the biscuit Cole had tossed her, the dry crumbs crumbling onto her lap. "What's in it?" she asked, her voice hoarse from dust and exhaustion. Cole crouched near the fire, feeding it a fresh branch, the flames licking his weathered hands. "Hope," he said, the word flat but not unkind. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cracked the silence, before shoving another bite into her mouth. It tasted like ash, but she chewed anyway, as if defiance alone could transform it into something nourishing. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the night, until a coyote's howl split the darkness, long and mournful. Myra's gaze flicked to the shadows beyond the fire's glow, where the canyons seemed to breathe with unseen things. "You ever been married?" she asked suddenly, her voice low, probing. Cole's face went still, the way a man's does when a memory slams into him like a fist. "Once," he said, his jaw tightening around the syllable. Mira hesitated, her fingers absently tracing the swell of her belly, feeling the baby kick, a frantic rhythm against her palm. "What happened?" The question hung between them, heavy as the smoke curling from the fire. Cole fed the flames again, the wood hissing as it caught. "Gallows," he muttered, the single word a tombstone. Mira flinched, her throat tightening. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the apology too small for the weight it carried. He shrugged, but the gesture didn't reach his eyes. "I carry her with me," he said, his voice gravelly, as though the words were lodged in his ribs. A beat passed, filled only by the wind skittering through the canyon like a restless ghost. Mira studied him, the scar that carved a crooked line from jaw to temple, the way his hands, calloused and scarred, moved with deliberate precision, as if every action was a penance. "You don't talk like the others," she said finally, her voice tinged with curiosity. Cole glanced up, his gaze sharp but unreadable. "The men who watched me die?" She tilted her chin toward the fire, her lips curving into something bitter. "They weren't men, just boys with beards," he said, the disdain in his tone cutting. Myra's laugh this time was softer, almost wistful. "They spat at my feet like they'd earned the right," she murmured, staring into the flames. "But the worst part wasn't the rope," she added, her voice fraying at the edges. "It was the silence." The words clung to the air, raw and unspooling. Cole leaned back on his elbows, his silhouette stark against the firelight. "You were there," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Still are." Mira nodded, her throat tightening around the lump of unsaid things. The shame, the fury, the hollow ache of being erased by the very people who'd sworn to see her. She wanted to explain how this silence had been a blade, sharper than any sheriff's knife, how it had sliced through her resolve until all that remained was the echo of her own heartbeat. But the words stuck, lodged like splinters in her chest. Outside, the coyote howled again, lonelier now, and the fire dimmed to a smolder, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to reach for them like skeletal fingers. Mira shifted, her back protesting the rocky ground, her body a map of bruises and fatigue. Cole rose without a word, retrieving his rifle from where it leaned against a boulder. He checked the chamber, the motion fluid and automatic before settling back down. "They'll regroup," he said, his voice low, practical. Mira didn't ask who. They both knew the silence wouldn't last forever. The night stretched thin around them, the stars above indifferent to the weight of their histories. Myra's hand drifted to her belly again, feeling the baby's restless movements, a tiny, stubborn heartbeat against her palm. She wondered if the child would inherit her resilience or her recklessness, her defiance or her scars. "You think we'll make it?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Cole didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the canyon walls met the sky. "Fear's a tool," he said after a long pause. "Just got to sharpen it right." Mira studied his profile, the way his jaw clenched like he was holding back a storm, and realized, with a pang, that hope, real, unshakable hope, was a luxury neither of them could afford yet. But for now, the fire burned, the canyon sheltered them, and the rope that should have ended her life hung loose and useless behind them, a severed tether to a fate they both refused to accept. The thunder of hooves erupted like a storm breaking over the canyon, shattering the fragile silence. Cole's hand shot out, smothering the fire with a flurry of dirt, its embers hissing into oblivion. "On your feet," he barked, his voice low but edged like a blade. Myra's legs trembled as she scrambled onto the horse, her fingers fumbling against the saddle leather, her breath ragged from the strain of the chase. The night air was sharp with the scent of sagebrush and impending rain, but sharper still was the metallic tang of fear. 3 riders materialized from the dark, their silhouettes jagged against the starless sky, rifles glinting like teeth in the gloom. A bullet screamed past Myra's ear, so close it shaved a lock of hair, and she flinched, her hand flying to her belly as if to shield the child within. "Something's wrong," she gasped, her voice fraying at the edges, her body coiling inward against the cramp that writhed beneath her ribs. Colden looked back. His grip on the reins tightened as he yanked the horse into a thicket, branches whipping his face, drawing thin lines of blood that mingled with sweat. The animal snorted, its flanks heaving, but Cole drove it forward, deeper into the maze of scrub and stone. "Not labor," he muttered, his tone clinical despite the chaos, his free hand brushing Myra's wrist to check her pulse. "Too fast, too shallow. Just a ride." She glared at him, her eyes wide and wild in the dim light. "Reassuring," she snapped, her sarcasm brittle, her knuckles white against the saddle horn. The horse stumbled as they crested a ledge, its hooves skidding on loose gravel. And for a heartbeat, Mira felt herself teetering over the edge, the abyss yawning below. Cole's arm shot around her waist, hauling her back just as the horse regained its footing, its breaths coming in ragged bursts. They slid from the saddle behind a cluster of boulders, the rocks cool and rough against Myra's trembling palms. Cole crouched, his rifle already drawn, his eyes scanning the shadows. "They'll regroup," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind that howled through the ravine like a wounded thing. Mira pressed her back to the stone, her breath fogging the air, her mind racing. "So we run again?" she asked, the question hollow, her body aching with the weight of exhaustion. Cole's gaze didn't waver. "No," he said, his jaw tightening, the flicker of a smile ghosting across his lips, grim, defiant. "We fight." She stared at him, her mouth falling open in disbelief. "You're crazy," she hissed, her voice a mix of fury and fear. Cole's smile deepened, though it never reached his eyes. "Maybe," he admitted, his fingers tightening around a rifle stock. "But I want them to wish they never chased us." He moved before she could argue, loading the chamber with practiced ease, his movements a study in controlled violence. Mira swallowed hard, her hand drifting to the knife strapped to her thigh, a pitiful weapon against rifles, but better than nothing. The wind carried the distant echo of hoofbeats, circling like vultures, and she closed her eyes, feeling the baby kick, a frantic, rhythmic plea against her palm. Alive, she thought, gritting her teeth. Still alive. Cole's voice cut through the tension, low and steady. "They'll come from the east. Distract them. I'll flank." Myra's eyes snapped open, her glare sharp enough to cut steel. "You think I'm staying behind?" she demanded, her voice trembling with equal parts rage and adrenaline. Cole met her gaze, unflinching. "I think you're protecting what matters," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Before she could respond, he was gone, melting into the dark like a shadow given form, his boots silent against the earth. Myra's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the shotgun across her lap suddenly unbearable. She clutched it tighter, her fingers numb, her breath shallow. The riders emerged like specters, their outlines wavering in the moonlight, their rifles raised. Myra's pulse roared in her ears as she stood, stepping into their line of sight, her silhouette stark against the rocks. "Here!" she shouted, her voice raw, her body rigid. One rider cursed, reining in his horse, but the others surged forward, their faces twisted in grim resolve. A shot cracked, the bullet grazing the stone beside her, and Mira dropped, rolling behind cover as splinters of rock bit into her skin. Above, Cole's rifle spoke. A sharp, thunderous bang, and one rider screamed, his body tumbling from the saddle like a sack of grain. Chaos erupted. Cole's voice echoed from the cliffs, steady as a heartbeat. Now! Mira rose, her shotgun barking twice in quick succession, the recoil jarring her already bruised ribs. A second rider fell, his mount rearing, but the third, Hank, lunged toward her, his revolver gleaming. Myra's fingers fumbled for the knife, but Cole was there, his Bowie knife flashing in the dark, its edge finding Hank's shoulder with surgical precision. The deputy howled, dropping his weapon, and Cole kicked him backward into the dirt. "Run," Cole growled, his voice devoid of mercy, and Hank fled, clutching his wound, his horse galloping after him like a spooked ghost. Silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by Myra's ragged breathing. Cole turned to her, his eyes scanning her body for wounds. "You're bleeding," he said, his thumb brushing the cut on her cheek, a relic of the gunfire. Mira laughed, short and breathless, her hands cradling her belly. "So are you," she countered, nodding at the gash on his temple. He didn't answer, just holstered his knife and offered her his hand. The ledge behind them glowed faintly in the dawn's first light, the canyon stretching ahead, a gauntlet of shadows and possibility. Mira took his hand, her grip iron. "Next time," she said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her limbs, "we don't split up." Cole nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Next time," he agreed, "we end it." The ranch reeked of time and ruin, its air thick with the sour tang of mildew, dried blood, and a faint metallic sting of old violence. Rotting timber groaned beneath their boots as Mira staggered across the sagging porch, her fingers trembling as she nailed boards over the cracked windows. The shotgun across her lap felt heavier than the weight of the child in her belly, its cold steel a silent promise of survival. Cole moved with practiced precision inside the house, his silhouette sharp against the dying light as he lined the floor with tripwires, the glint of his Bowie knife catching her eye as he secured a rope to a rusted nail. "You ever shoot?" he asked, his voice low but steady, as if testing the resolve beneath her fear. Mira didn't look up, her hammer striking the nail with deliberate force. "My daddy taught me before he drank himself into the ground," she muttered, the memory of his calloused hands guiding hers at the age of 12 flickering like a ghost. Cole tossed her the shotgun without another word, the stock landing in her arms with a thud. "Good," he said, loading his revolver. "We'll need both barrels." Night fell like a shroud, swallowing the ranch in shadows that clung to the walls like vengeful spirits. The wind hissed through the cracks in the siding, carrying Deputy Hank's voice from the darkness, a taunt laced with venom. "Got yourself a hideout, hot cowboy." Before the words fully dissolved, Cole fired, the rifle's report splitting the stillness. A porch post exploded inches from Myra's shoulder, splinters raining down like cursed confetti. She didn't flinch, her eyes locked on the flicker of lantern light beyond the fence as buckshot tore through the barn's side, shredding wood into deadly slivers. Cole yanked her down just as a bullet shattered the window behind them, glass raining like frozen tears. "You all right?" He barked, his body shielding hers as dust choked the air. Mira pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the baby kick, a frantic, rhythmic plea. "Still here," she gasped, her voice tight around the adrenaline. Outside, Hank's silhouette retreated, his curses swallowed by the night. Mira crept to the window, her breath fogging the grimy glass as she watched him vanish into the trees, his horse's hooves kicking up sparks. "He'll come back with more," she whispered, the certainty of it coiling in her gut like dread. Cole nodded, reloading his rifle with mechanical focus. "We run now. Next time we end it." His voice was flat, but his eyes betrayed a storm. A man who'd spent years outrunning ghosts only to find himself cornered by the living. He knelt beside her, his hand brushing hers as he passed the canteen. "Drink." You'll need your strength. Mira obeyed, the water cool and metallic on her tongue, as the baby kicked again, harder this time. She wondered if the child felt the weight of their flight, the unspoken pact between two fugitives bound by survival and something quieter, something neither dared name yet. The ranch creaked around them, its bones aching with the memory of forgotten lives. Myra's gaze drifted to the blood-stained dirt outside, the dark smear where Hank's horse had trampled the earth, a temporary victory in a war of attrition. Cole's boots scuffed the floorboards as he paced, his shadow stretching long in the firelight. "They'll regroup," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Mira stood, the shotgun steady in her hands. "Then let them," she said, her voice hardening like cooling iron. "But they'll find we don't fold easy." Cole studied her, the flicker of something like pride crossing his face before he turned back to the window. The night stretched thin, the ranch a fragile sanctuary in a world that had already tried to erase them once. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, lonely and sharp, as Mira tightened her grip on the shotgun and waited for dawn to decide their next move. Rain lashed the canyon in sheets, the storm's fury drumming against the cave roof like a war drum. Mira jolted awake to the sound of thunder cracking, so close it seemed to split the rocks beneath her. Her blanket was soaked, her dress clinging to her skin, the chill seeping into her bones. She shivered violently, her hand instinctively cradling her belly as the baby kicked, a frantic, rhythmic protest against the chaos. Across the cave, Cole sat hunched against the wall, his silhouette sharp in the flickering firelight. His hat hid his eyes, but the glow caught the edge of his scar, making it look like a fresh wound. "You sleep?" she rasped, her throat raw from the damp air. He didn't move. "No, you breathe?" she tried again, half teasing, half terrified. His lips twitched, a ghost of a smirk. "Barely." The storm boomed again, closer this time, the lightning illuminating the cave in ghostly flashes. Mira shifted, wincing as her back protested. "This baby's stubborn," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Cole's gaze flicked to her, his eyes narrowing as if assessing the weight of her words. "Takes after you," he said flatly, but there was no mockery in it, only something quieter, something like admiration. Mira laughed, startled by the sound in the oppressive dark. It echoed off the stone, fragile and bright. For a moment, the cave felt less like a tomb, the storm less like a siege. Her laughter faded as another crack of thunder rolled overhead. She studied Cole, the way his shoulders hunched forward, how his fingers absently traced the grain of his revolver's handle. "Your wife, what was her name?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of all she didn't know about him. The man who'd cut a rope to save her, who carried silence like armor. Cole's jaw tightened, his hands stilling on the gun. "Clara," he said at last, the name a blade unsheathed. "Pretty name. Tough. Meaner than I was." His voice was flat, but his knuckles whitened against the metal. Mira hesitated, the baby's kicks sharp against her palm. "Did she die alone?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, and immediately the cave seemed to shrink. Cole's eyes met hers, dark and unreadable. "No," he said slowly, the syllables stretched thin. I held her hand. Rain hissed as it seeped through a crack in the rock, pooling near his boots. Myra's throat tightened. "Lucky," she whispered, not sure if she meant Clara or herself. Cole stared at the rain beyond the cave mouth, his face carved from stone. "North," he said suddenly. "Ash Hollow. Quiet place." His voice was distant, as if he were already there, miles away from the storm and the ghosts it dragged with it. Mira smiled faintly, the expression tinged with exhaustion. "Sounds like something Clara would say." Lightning lit his face, sharp and fleeting, revealing a flash of grief, so raw it made her breath catch. She would, he admitted, the words barely audible. A beat passed, filled only by the rain's relentless rhythm. Mira shifted again, her belly aching from the baby's movements. "Do you think she'd have hated me?" she asked, the vulnerability in her voice a stark contrast to the storm. Cole turned to her fully, his gaze steady. "No," he said after a long pause. "She'd have said you were too soft. Then she'd have taught you how to shoot straight." The fire crackled, spitting embers into the damp air. Mira pressed her back to the cave wall, her fingers tracing the swell of her stomach. "What was she like?" she pressed, needing to know, needing to fill the silence with something other than thunder. Cole exhaled slowly, as if weighing the cost of every word. "She had a laugh like a knife," he said finally. "Could gut a man with a look. But she saw things. The truth of people, even when they lied to themselves." His voice hardened. "She saw me." Myra's chest ached at the rawness in his tone. "And what did she see?" she asked softly. Cole's fingers tightened on his revolver. "A coward," he said bluntly. "A man who let her hang because he was too slow to cut the rope." The admission hung between them, heavier than the storm. Myra's hand drifted to her belly, the baby's kicks a lifeline against her palm. "You weren't slow," she said fiercely. "You were alive. That's what matters." Cole didn't answer. Outside, the rain began to ease, the thunder retreating to the horizon like a sullen beast. He stood abruptly, stretching his legs, his movements stiff. "Get some rest," he muttered. "We ride at first light." Mira watched him disappear into the shadows of the cave, his silhouette blending with the dark. She closed her eyes, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she listened to the rain's fading whispers and wondered if Clara's ghost walked beside them, or if Cole carried her in the spaces between his words, the way he carried his guilt. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the canyon glistening under a pale sun. Mira stirred, her body aching, her mind tangled in the remnants of dreams she couldn't recall. Cole crouched near the fire, sharpening his Bowie knife with methodical precision. He didn't look at her as he spoke. Ash Hollow's a week's ride. Mira sat up slowly, her hand steadying herself against the cave wall. "And after that?" she asked, the question laced with unspoken fears. Cole paused, the blade catching the light as he turned it over in his hand. "After that," he said quietly, "we keep walking until the past stops chasing us." Mira nodded, though doubt gnawed at her resolve. She thought of the gallows, of the rope that should have ended her, of the child inside her who would never know the father who had left her. And she thought of Cole, his haunted eyes, his silence, the way he'd chosen to save her when no one else had. The baby kicked again, sharp and insistent, as if urging her forward. Mira pressed her palm to her belly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Then we'd better start moving." The church reeked of hypocrisy, its air thick with the cloying scent of old incense and the sour undertones of judgment. Dust motes swirled in the slanted light, filtering through cracked stained glass, casting fractured shadows over the rows of townsfolk who filled the pews like jurors in the silent court. Mira stood alone at the center, her spine straight despite the weight of her belly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The preacher's voice droned, a monotone recitation of scripture that felt more like a eulogy than a defense. But when the doctor spoke, his testimony halting yet resolute about the bruises that had bloomed on her wrists, the truth of her pregnancy, he faltered under the weight of his own complicity in the lies of Dry Creek. The pastor's wife followed, her voice trembling as she described Myra's quiet strength mending dresses for orphans, her refusal to flinch even as the ghosts of her past clawed at her heels. Cole waited in the back, his silhouette sharp against the dim light, one hand resting on the revolver at his hip like it was an extension of his resolve. When he finally stepped forward, the room stilled as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen. "I've killed men," he began, his voice gravel, his eyes fixed on Mira. "Some for money, some for mistakes." A child coughed in the back, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. "But I never saved one. Until her." His words hung like a blade over the congregation, cutting through their pretenses. Myra's eyes glistened, but she held his gaze, the unspoken weight of their shared survival pressing against the space between them. The preacher's wife dabbed at her cheeks with a handkerchief. Micah, the marshal, leaned forward in his seat, his expression unreadable. The verdict came swiftly, innocent. A single word that should have shattered the chains of Myra's past, but instead felt fragile, like glass held too tightly. Yet as the townsfolk murmured, the church doors burst open at dusk, torchlight bleeding into the sanctuary. Dry Creek's mob poured in, their faces twisted with righteous fury, flames casting jagged shadows that danced like vengeful spirits. Myra stepped forward, her belly a shield against the chaos. Her voice cutting through the din. "I walked to my death once," she declared, her words sharp as flint. "You watched. You cheered. Now I'm here." The crowd wavered, their torches flickering like dying stars. Micah moved beside her, his rifle raised, his voice a thunderclap. This town saw her, judged her, freed her. The mob hesitated, their chants faltering as they faced the unyielding line of Ash Hollow citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, mothers, who stood shoulder to shoulder with Myra. One by one, the torchbearers lowered their flames, the heat of their hatred cooling in the face of her unflinching stare. When the last ember sputtered out, Myra turned to Cole, her voice soft but unshaken. "Still want to run?" He shook his head, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "No, let's build." The church emptied, its hypocrisy drowned in the quiet victory of a town that had chosen to see. Outside, the night air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth, the mob's ashes scattering like forgotten embers. Myra's hand drifted to her belly, the baby's kicks a steady drumbeat of defiance. Cole fell in a step beside her, his rifle slung low, his posture loose but alert. Ash Hollow stretched before them, a patchwork of weathered buildings and cautious hope. For the first time, Myra felt the weight of her past lift, replaced by the fragile promise of roots. They passed the livery, where children peeked from windows, their wide eyes reflecting the stars. The doctor's clinic glowed with lamplight, the pastor's wife waving gently from the porch. Myra paused at the edge of the square, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they come back?" Cole didn't stop walking, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the canyon walls met the sky. "They'll find we don't fold easy." She nodded, the resolve in her chest hardening like cooling iron. Ahead, the lean-to where their cot lay waiting, the basin of warm disconnect, the tin comb left as a silent promise of care. Behind them, the gallows of Dry Creek stood empty, its rope unused, its shadow shrinking under the weight of a life they refused to let it steal. The baby came under a tin roof that groaned like a living thing, its corrugated sheets shuddering under the weight of a storm that refused to break. Myra's screams were muffled by a torn leather strap clamped between her teeth, her knuckles white against the cot's wooden frame as sweat slicked her brow. The preacher's wife hovered nearby, hands trembling, her prayers swallowed by the thunder that rolled low and hungry across the canyon. When the child finally slipped into the world, red-faced and wailing, Myra collapsed against the damp mattress, her breath ragged but her eyes locked on the bundle in Cole's arms. He held the infant as though she might dissolve like mist, his calloused hands shaking, not from fear, but the weight of a truth he could barely name. "See ya," Myra murmured, her voice frayed at the edges, the name settling over them like a vow. "Means regret, means healing." Cole didn't answer, just traced a finger along the baby's clenched fist, the scar on his jaw twitching as if the words had carved something deeper than flesh. The marshal came again at dawn, his boots crunching through the frost-stiff grass outside the livery, his men fanning out like shadows with rifles. Myra stood in the doorway. Sia strapped her chest, her shotgun resting easy in her grip. Cole flanked her, his revolver already drawn, the weight of history pressing against his ribs. "I'm not afraid to die," she said, her voice steady as flint, though her thumb brushed the baby's cheek, a silent promise to herself. The marshal dismounted slowly, his badge dull in the morning light, his eyes flicking to the child. "Then you won't mind making this easy," he replied, but the line in his tone was as thin as the smile that followed. Cole fired first, the rifle's report splitting the air like a lightning strike. The marshal dove for cover as dust erupted around them, bullets tearing through the lean-to's walls, splinters raining down like cursed confetti. Mira moved like a woman who'd already stared down the gallows, fluid, relentless, her shotgun barking twice before the deputy could draw. One man fled, two fell. When the smoke cleared, only the marshal remained, bleeding out in the dirt, his hand clutching a wound that gurgled with every ragged breath. "You think this changes anything?" he gasped, his voice a rasp of defiance. Cole holstered his gun, his shadow stretching long over the dying man. "It already did," he said, turning away as the marshal's final breath hissed into the wind. They buried the dead in silence, the earth hard and unyielding beneath their boots. No words, no stones, just shallow graves and the caw of crows circling overhead. That night, they camped beneath cottonwoods whose leaves whispered secrets to the stars. Mira leaned into Cole, her temple pressed to his shoulder, Sia sleeping between them, her tiny fists curled like petals. "Strange man," Mira muttered, her breath warm against his coat. Cole's arm tightened around her, his chin resting on her hair. "I'm yours," he said, the syllables rough but unshakable, a truth etched into every scar he carried. Morning came without ceremony, the horizon bleeding into gold as they packed the horse in silence. The frontier didn't offer peace, it never had, but it gave them something sharper, the freedom to carve their own path, one bloodied step at a time. Behind them, Ash Hollow faded into the distance, its streets quiet but watchful. Ahead, the land stretched vast and unclaimed, the wind carrying the scent of sagebrush and possibility. Sia stirred in Myra's sling, her cries swallowed by the rhythm of hooves, a lullaby written in motion. Cole rode close, his eyes scanning the ridgelines, his hand never far from the revolver at his hip. They didn't speak of the gallows left behind, the rope that had never tightened around Myra's throat, or the ghost that still walked beside them. Some truths didn't need words. They lived in the spaces between shots fired, in the weight of a child's breath against a mother's heart, in the unspoken pact of two souls who'd chosen to keep breathing long after the world had tried to erase them. The frontier was cruel, but so were they now, hardened by fire, tempered by loss, and relentless as the horizon itself. And somewhere, far behind, the gallows stood empty, their shadow shrinking under the sun's unrelenting gaze, a monument to the woman who'd refused to die and the man who'd learned, finally, to cut the rope.